Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Dirk Verheyen. I'm academic director at the FUBiS program at Freie Universität Berlin. And it is my pleasure and honor on behalf of Freie Universität Berlin and of the FUBiS and FUBiS programs, the two co-sponsors of this event, to welcome you to the summer edition of Berlin Talks. Berlin Talks is a series of panel discussions that started last fall, in part because of the pandemic causing trouble for us to run our programs in their usual fashion. And so we offer these panel discussions online on various topics of current interest, with a panel composed of people from inside and outside Germany, perhaps connected to the university here, but also well beyond, as will be the case, for example, today. Just a quick word about the two sponsoring organizing programs. The FUBiS program is the Freie Universität Berlin European Studies program. It is a semester-based program with fall and spring semesters offering German language and subject courses, as well as a broad cultural and social framework program, also travel, excursions, and so forth. FUBiS is Freie Universität Berlin International Summer and Winter University. It offers 3 sessions during the year, 1 in January, and then 2 during the summer. This program also features German language instruction as well as subject courses taught in part in English and part in German, and also a framework program to give students an intercultural experience. So these are the two programs that have joined together to bring to you a series of panel discussions. Just a quick word here about tonight's event. In a technical sense, the event is being recorded. We have a YouTube channel at which we will post this event later. But you as an audience, members of the audience, will not have your identities revealed in this recording, so you will remain anonymous. We also invite you in the course of the event to use the chat option to submit comments or questions, and hopefully we'll have the chance to turn to some of those in the course of the next 90 minutes. So the topic for today is the topic of young globalization. That is the role and impact of young individuals, young leaders in a world that may be oriented more and more in a post-national direction or a supranational direction, an international direction as a result of globalization. And so we want to focus tonight on some of the issues posed by the presence of younger generations, young professionals in international affairs. And we will present to you 6 examples. 5 already have joined us. The 6th person we are waiting for, we hope that she is going to be able to navigate the technology and get the connection established. And so I would like to take this opportunity first to introduce our panel members. Nasrat Khalid has his roots in Afghanistan, but he's joining us from the Alexandria, Virginia area in the United States. Nasrat is an entrepreneur who wants to help connect the world's most underdeveloped countries to the digital economy. He's the founder of Asil app and Aval development. He specializes in issues related to technology, economic growth, and innovation. He's part of a group of young global changer ambassadors, active in global forums and conferences, and is a speaker in the TEDx program, a grassroots initiative that is focused on ideas worth spreading. And then we are joined by Annika Zaumi. Annika Zaumi has a passion for mainstreaming diversity and inclusion at all levels of government and civic organizations. She is the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation and also serves in multiple advisory roles. She is currently the chair of Girls Action Foundation, the Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for Leading Change Canada, and a regional focal point for the United Nations major group of children and youth. Leading Change is a movement of young leaders and sustainability professionals accelerating action on issues that are critical to attaining a sustainable, prosperous, and socially just future within a generation. In her role at Leading Change Canada, she works to integrate equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice meaningfully into the pursuit of sustainability, clean energy, and circular economies. Annika holds a master's degree in social justice and equity studies from Brock University. And then we're joined by Nils Feller, who is located here in Germany, but is joining us tonight, as it turns out, from Egypt. Nils Feller is an experienced development professional and part of the Young Global Changers, a community of young people that works towards recoupling societies, economies, and the environment. As a member of the Young Global Changers Working Group on Multilateralism, he explores the challenges of and solutions to a more effective and representative multilateral order. The working group proposes a youth alliance for multilateralism with the aim of contributing to a more inclusive and effective multilateral order and to deliver tangible results on global challenges. Radha Kulkarni joins us from India. She works at the intersection of finance, strategy, and policy with experience across the private sector, nonprofits, government, and multilaterals. She recently finished her assignment with UNICEF in New York as a part of the multi-sector coalition Generation Unlimited, focusing on the needs of 1.8 billion young people worldwide. She also led its shared value partnerships across 32 countries. Prior to this, she worked with the United Nations Development Program in New York in the Policy Bureau on Development Financing. Before the UN in New York, she did stints with the UN in Indonesia and in Singapore, and at the Chief Minister's Office in India. Radha is a chartered accountant with master's degrees in business administration and public administration from Columbia University in New York. And our fifth panel member, again, number 6 has not yet checked in. Our fifth panel member is Sophie Davies, who's joining us from Great Britain. Sophie is Chief Executive Officer at the Future Leaders Network, a nonprofit aimed at discovering and developing the next generation of leaders in the United Kingdom. In 2021, she also holds the title of Chair of the Y7, which is the official youth engagement group for the G7 Leaders Summit. And as we all know, that summit just took place. Over the last 8 months, Sophie has led a team of 30 volunteers, all under the age of 30, to deliver an inclusive, impactful, and developmental Y7 process, which has seen young people, for the first time in history, speaking at official G7 ministerial and working group meetings, attending international press events, and collaborating with policy experts. She was a recipient of several recognitions or awards in recent times. So with that, I welcome our panel. Wonderful that you could all join tonight at some different time zones. Before we get to our first question, which traditionally is posed to all of our panel members, I want to give you, the audience, a brief introduction to the background of the theme of today. And the theme today is composed of 2 parts. On the one hand, we're dealing with the issue, the realities of globalization. And on the other hand, of the question of younger generations' involvement in political life, in international life in this case. And so we are going to show you some slides, some statistics, some images regarding globalization. And the first thing we see here is a report in which also the newspaper The Independent was involved, where a measurement was developed, an index was developed in terms of countries' level of globalization. That is, to what extent countries are entangled in international affairs in a variety of different ways. And different indicators were used for this, and they came up with a top 15. And what you see there is that almost all of the cases are EU countries, with the exception of Canada and Singapore, which also join the top 15 group. And then we go to the next picture. And this picture shows you basically the development, the growth of globalization over the time period 2001 to 2020. And this particular graph was produced by DHL, which has a so-called global connectedness index, which it produces year to year. And it gives us an indication that when we think of globalization, there are at least 4 areas that we can think of that are essential. And that is trade, capital or money, investments, information, and people. And what stands out here, of course, is that the case of capital and people and trade, these lines stay pretty close together. What really jumps out is the exponential growth in terms of globalization of the flow of information. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the internet and the various sources of interconnection in terms of information and communication. What we also see is that once we get to 2020, the graphs become iffy, to use that word, because of the pandemic. We will have to see how in the next few years these graphs are impacted by the pandemic. You see at an earlier point, there was an impact, particularly in the area of capital movement due to the financial crisis. It is too soon to tell how this pandemic over the last 2 years is going to impact the patterns of globalization. We go to a further picture, which again shows these moving lines, but then for several countries. The top 2 are also in the top 15 of globalized countries, Netherlands and Ireland. And then we have the United Kingdom, Germany, the US, Romania is picked as an example, also Japan, and then China and India round out this particular sample. Again, here we're talking about an index that is developed in terms of the level of globalized engagement of these countries and how that has developed since 1990. It's quite dramatic when you take a country like Romania and you see where in 1990, with the collapse of communism, Romania started off, and where it has ended up as of 2018. So you can get a sense here of countries also related relative to one another in the process of globalization. We have a further picture, and here I have this one and the next one drawn from the Global Presence study of the Elcano Institute. This is a Spanish institute that researches the presence in the international sphere of individual countries and tries to come up with a cumulative picture. And it discusses this presence in 3 areas. The soft area, which reminds us of the soft power phenomenon, and that can be economics, can be science, information, culture, and so on. Then there's an economic sector, that's the blue part of this graph, of this image. And then you have the green part, which is the military. And so what you see is that with just over 40%, the economic element predominates here in terms of global presence that countries have, followed by about 36% for the softer sector of information, culture, science, and so on, and then about a quarter for the military. And we can go to one more picture there. There you see these 3 dimensions, the soft dimension, the military dimension, the economic dimension in a time perspective again. Starting in 1990, they usually then take the end of the Cold War, so to speak, as a starting point, and then it goes on from there. So there we have some images, first of all, in terms of globalization. But now comes the next part that I want to introduce, and that is the question of participation, particularly of younger generations. Because in this globalized context, who participates, who decides, who has power, who has influence? How is this distributed? And particularly, what is the impact of younger generations in this particular context? And here we have a slide that I want to show you that comes from a book that was published just a couple of years ago called Youthquake by James Sloan and Matt Henn. And they build on research that dates back to the 1970s, at that point engaged in by Ronald Inglehart, called the Silent Revolution. And what this is all about is shifting patterns of political participation away from the established political party kind of involvement and more protest movements, petitions, other kinds of possibilities for engagement. And that is in particular also where younger people seem to be making their mark more and more in different societies. Sometimes there's also talk about the young millennials and how they have an impact on their society and beyond. The interesting dimension for us here tonight is that what one sees in different countries is that this engagement by younger generations goes in two directions. One is a more cosmopolitan direction, or to use the David Goodhart, he's a British sociologist term, this is the anywhere type of perspective. People who feel comfortable moving around the world in different cultures and get involved in this globalized environment. The other side is sometimes connected to populism in general discussion, or nationalistic authoritarian reaction to globalization, in which we also find people from younger generations who feel left out, who don't feel clued in to this pattern of global activity because of lack of education or opportunity or various kinds of inequalities and so on. And so what we are dealing with here, and this chart shows it, is an interconnection of three dynamics. One is the economics and social changes that have been taking place and continue to take place. Secondly, political changes, and then the consequences of that in terms of youth political participation. And so what this image is trying to suggest is that these are wheels that are interlocking, that they influence one another, and in the end influence this pattern of young participation, young generation participation. We have a panel tonight involving individuals who belong to the younger generation who have gotten very involved, as I've already described in the introduction. And there is, in a way, perhaps a conundrum, a dilemma. When one gets involved in, say, international affairs, as all panel members have done, there is a sense of dynamism, idealism, a wish to change, to bring improvement to things. And yet at the same time, one starts out or is involved in networks, in patterns, in structures, in organizations that are established already. United Nations is a good example. So the question there is, how does one navigate the tensions between one's own idealism and desire to bring about change and the resistance that structures and organizations may cause there for one's own activity? And so my opening question, and the panel members already knew about this question, I'm not asking them all of a sudden, is to reflect on their own biography, where they have come from, where they are right now, and how they have encountered perhaps this issue, this tension between their own idealism and established structures that they have to navigate and try to deal with. And I would like to invite Nasrat Khalid to go first.
Awesome, thanks so much. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I spent pretty much all of my professional life working with multilateral institutions. I spent 7 years with the World Bank here in DC and Afghanistan and other countries. Some engagement with the German Development Institute and the American, the State Department and all of that. And there is, I think what we need to realize, and certainly I did, was what you're referring to as being an idealist person. I think that needs to change into practically understanding the technical aspects of everything we're referring to, from migration, which is a technical idea. It can be to the use of internet innovation, trade, and so on. I think it's upon us to first understand the practical aspects of what we're doing, to learn, and then when we start getting engaged with multilateral institutions, it's also important to not just, see the programs the way they are designed and just accept them. There has to be room for the programs to improve. And so that middle ground is something that all young people have to try to get to.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to Annika Zaumi.
Sure, thanks so much for having me here. So when I think about this question and I really think through what are the significant barriers that are preventing young people from getting meaningfully involved, and I use the word meaningfully very intentionally here. I want us to think through not just having young people visibly involved, but actually the work and the nature of the work fundamentally changing as a result of having young participation. And I turn to or think of the social work or the social movements that are really top of mind here in the Canadian context, in the North American context, and something that I'm seeing ripple out across different contexts. And I think specifically to a lot of the conversations around systemic oppression or systemic barriers, and how the ways that systems have existed or been created, most often as a result of colonial legacies, being one of the reinforcers or inhibitors of meaningful youth participation. One example I think of is in Canada. We're working really intentionally, or we're doing our best to engage with Indigenous communities. So some of the first Indigenous peoples who have lived here and who are the original holders of the land. And one thing that's very, very interesting from Indigenous epistemology is this knowledge of all age groups, of all individuals as being critical parts of the conversation, and how just because someone might have a different level of experience doesn't mean their expertise is superior to that of young people. And that's something that I really hope to draw upon, is this perspective of let's break down what we have assumed to be the default or best systems of power, and learn and lean into those non-traditional or systemically underrepresented bodies of knowledge, particularly as they relate to youth participation.
Thank you, Annika. May I turn next to Nils in Egypt? Tell us your perspective on this conundrum, on this question, on this dilemma.
Yes, thank you very much, Dirk. And let me start by also saying thank you for the opportunity to participate in tonight's panel and to speak on behalf of the young global changers and represent us in this panel. I think, as some others on this panel, I started my personal career at the UN and then moved into the private sector for the exact reasons that is at the core of this question, because inevitably your personal motivation runs into the barriers of the established structures that are present in these multilateral processes and institutions. And I think to overcome that, and for younger people to really be agents of change, our perspectives need to be represented, because otherwise the status quo will continue to operate as usual. And I think more importantly, even representation needs to translate into participation, so that young generations with a vested interest in the future of our planet are really represented at decision-making tables, so that as youth we can demand for issues, whether we work in social or in the cultural sphere, whether we work in business and politics or beyond, that we can advocate for change and also ask for our interests to be represented. And I think on top of that, like stepping out of these or stepping away from the issue of representation and participation, I think it's also important to connect with people beyond your immediate surroundings. I think Anita, what you also said is that people carry very individual perspectives and their realities are very individual. And so I think as our generation has a certain awareness, but also is aware of our responsibility to connect with one another so that there's true representation that is beyond just the Western Hemisphere, but where the perspective of all young people are represented. And when we look at the social movements where that happens, like for instance, Fridays for Future, we can see that change can happen and the decision makers will be held accountable, not to talk the talk of our generation, but actually to walk the walk towards a fair and more equitable and sustainable future.
Thank you, Nils. Radha, your take on this issue?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And it's been great being here with all of you. So thank you for that. In terms of the question, yes, of course, I have experienced this dilemma of conforming to established structures and patterns, especially given the multilateral setup that I have worked on, right from, say a country office in Indonesia to a regional office in Singapore, which kind of looks at Asia Pacific, to the headquarters in New York, across agencies, UNDP, UNICEF, and I worked a lot with other multilaterals such as OECD, World Bank, the IMF, given my intersection of finance, strategy and policy. So really this dilemma persists, and there are a lot of structures and patterns because it is like a giant bureaucracy, and processes entail arduous consensus building processes. I think hence the lack of agility. So I think on the one hand, idealism is great. However, one quickly realizes that one needs to be really pragmatic to be able to even engage in that kind of an environment and then being able to make a difference going forward. So I would say that what really helped me in dealing with it is that I never gave up. I never settled. I kept looking till the point I felt like I was in a place where the environment was cohesive enough, where I could make a sustainable and long-term impact. It could be, right from trying to, dismantle hierarchies to self-managed teams, from competition to collaboration, from risk aversion to innovation. And I think most importantly, leading from the front and proactively being the change one wishes to see, really. So I think it's different for different people, but I think it's important that us as young people and all the young people listening, that we don't give up. We keep looking and keep moving forward and be pragmatic so that one day we can be idealistic.
Thank you, Radha. I turn to Sophie Daud. I would say that probably there's fewer things that sort of symbolize established power more than the G7, I would suggest. And Y7 as a counterpoint, that strikes me as something that goes right at the heart of this question. How have you experienced this issue, this dilemma, this contrast, and what's your view of this?
Yeah, thank you. I think I guess I want to put a bit of context around my stance on this problem. And the first is that the G7, as you say, is a kind of well-established point of establishment, I guess you would discuss. It's an annual gathering of world leaders from the seven most advanced or most developed, or whatever you want to call them, economies in the world: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the UK, US, as well as the EU. The G7 has this mechanism, which is quite unusual for it. It has this process by which non-state actors have the ability to intervene. And these are called engagement groups. And there are a bunch of engagement groups, various ones supported by different governments whenever they kind of take on the presidency. And they're all quite different. And this is really interesting. And there's a reason behind this background, because, for example, they include the Business 7, which in the UK is run by the Confederation of British Industry. It's got lots of money. It includes the Science 7, which is run by the Royal Society in the United Kingdom. Also, lots of money. The Youth 7, by counterpart, is the newest of these groups. It actually started its life as a kind of mock G7, by which, young people as these amateur citizens got to like have a go at being world leaders and how nice for them. Like quite patronizing is the honest answer. That's how it started its life. You know, young people's the Y7 started as this kind of nice to have, like pat on the back, go like here's where the kids get involved and then we send them away. So in taking on the role of chair this year as part of the UK's G7 presidency, I had to really think about what I wanted the Y7 to achieve and how I wanted to do that. And so the first thing I thought about was actually like, why do we exist? Why does youth participation matter? The reason why it matters is young people are increasingly dissatisfied with democracy across the world, but you know, also across the G7, down kind of 20 percentage points back from the 20% from the just before the financial crisis. That's worrying because democracy, I think, you know, has various pros and cons, but if it's a project that we want to nurture, we really have to invest in it. And the reason why young people tend to say they're dissatisfied with democracy is a bunch of things, but partially because young people are underrepresented in positions of power, and young people experience severe wealth inequality, either through youth unemployment or the fact that young people tend to get paid a lot less than their older counterparts, regardless of their skills. So there's a kind of really big reason as to why this matters. And so to shift that, you really have to say, well, we want young people to get involved in decisions that affect their future. And we want young people to be involved now and young people in the future. So we're not always acting just for ourselves right here, right now. We're acting for those who are yet to come and making sure that we're creating space for them to engage in decision making. And so that was our end goal, right? We started off by saying, why do we exist and why does this matter? We then turned to kind of what is the barrier to that happening? The first was young people don't tend to have access to decision makers. So unlike the Royal Society or the Confederation of British Industry, prior to this process starting, young people couldn't just pick up the phone and say, hey guys, you know, we think this is a really important issue. Maybe you should think about it. Young people just don't have that access route in. The second issue, young people tend to operate on quite a haphazard level. So like they'll come up with a statement in like 30 minutes just before the kind of the big decision is meant to happen. And that's often too late. You know, influencing happens really, really early on in the process. And finally, when young people say something, no one listens. If you think about, you know, a minister or like the chief executive of the Confederation of British Industry, when they make a statement, someone listens. When I make a statement, no one cares. So there's this really interesting imbalance of power. How did I solve this problem? And this is something that we really thought about. And as I say, you know, when we started this whole process, I created a theory of change as to how I reached my end goal despite the problems I was encountering at the start. And there were a couple of things that we have particularly taken. And I'm not saying they're the right answers, but they're the answers that we took. The first was we shifted from advocacy towards participation. So instead of saying young people are separate to the establishment, we said we want to bring young people into the establishment. We want to tackle that underrepresentation gap by bringing young people to the decision-making tables so their voices are heard. It's not a perfect answer. I will grant you that. There will be times when those decision-making processes are going to be bureaucratic and they're going to ignore you, but nonetheless, really, really important to have them there. And we did that. For the first time in history, we had young people speaking to G7 ministers, to G7 diplomats, talking about the things that they really cared about. And that's really important. And I'm going to come back to a really great example of how this worked. The second thing we did was we got people who were within the establishment to champion us. We found allies who could support young people, whatever was going to happen. So these include like directors of big health funds or big organizations in the UK who mentored the delegates, but who also championed their views, which meant that when we spoke, it wasn't just young people speaking, it was actually someone in the establishment speaking. And it meant that actually people listened to us. And then finally, we worked really hard on actually getting young people involved really early. So instead of young people producing a statement right at the very end of the process, we got them involved all the time. Now, how do I think that's actually had a real impact? Prime example, the G7, when they were talking about their health priorities for this year, were talking about pandemic preparedness. They were talking about vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. Great, wonderful. When we spoke to young people, they said mental health was the one thing that they wanted to see world leaders talking about, and it was nowhere on the agenda. Through our actions of participation, getting young people at the table with decision makers, through having these amazing advocates, but also through having these incredible dialogues with decision makers, what happened? Our young people said, your mental health mattered. I actually interviewed the Prime Minister because we created credibility by being at these tables. I interviewed the Prime Minister. I asked him about mental health. And then just a day before the G7 happened, I asked the Prime Minister, will mental health be in the leaders' communique? Do you know what he said? He said yes. And as a direct result of what young people had done. So what I hope I've just said.
I have to ask you, I know you're going to tell us all about the G7 meeting, what happened in the background, but we do need to move along a little bit here at this point. I want to come back to what you have introduced because it really gets into your work, of course. But I want to, get further now with the other panel members also in some of the other issues that they also have raised. I want to go back for a moment to Nasrat. Nasrat, you are dealing with the country of your roots, Afghanistan, a highly complex place, conflict-ridden for decades now. And recently you contributed to a book called Securitizing Youth, Young People's Roles in the Global Peace and Security Agenda. So one of the issues of global affairs is the very dramatic war and peace issue. And there's probably few countries one can think of where that is a more dramatic issue than in the case of Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit about that book, what led you to this project or participating in it, and what's the vision, what's the idea where young people can have an impact in the case of Afghanistan, but beyond also?
Yeah, so my experience with war comes from living in Afghanistan. I have firsthand seen conflict and what it can do to a country, what it can do to young people. And right now I have a team of 20 people who work in Kabul, and how we manage to work through that situation is something that, when I went back to Afghanistan in 2009, I was a pretty young guy, and I wanted to get a job, and so I had to navigate through this this whole conflict environment. It started getting worse, and I had always had a vision, and so does a lot of Afghan young women and men, because on both sides, if you're looking at the Taliban or other groups, the fighters are usually youth. And so on the other side, when a bomb blast happens in the city or in schools, which has happened just 2 weeks ago, the casualties are also young people. But the decision makers, the people who talk about war, are always old people. If that is the Taliban, if that's the Afghan government, if that's the UN, if anybody, the discussion and the decisions that are taken are usually affecting the youth, but they are never in the table. And so with that in mind, and seeing that firsthand experience that I had with the war in Afghanistan, and I'm going through on a weekly basis even now, I thought it's important to portray the voice and just kind of come down to where does this conflict come from? I don't think many people, including the head of G7 or G20 countries, actually understand conflict. And when we get to the discussion of globalization, that Afghanistan is not in the discussion, because somehow there are countries out there that are just like that. There has been war for many years. And so if I wanted to go to Germany, I would have to go through a 2 months process of getting a visa, which I can't get in Afghanistan. So I have to go to Dubai. And which young guy in Afghanistan can go to Dubai or Delhi? Those are the problems that I saw firsthand, and they inspired me to write something. I'm a technical guy by my background, all have to do with IT, but I had to do that pivot to portray that story. And so in short, the book, Securitizing Youth, I have a copy here, I focus on the very limited literature that encourages youth participation in conflict prevention, is the UN Security Council Resolution 2250. Very limited. There is not even a bigger global conference where young people can come together and talk about conflict. A very small UN resolution focuses on that. There's 5 pillars to it: participation, protection, prevention, partnership and disengagement, and then reintegration. I focus on prevention, and I developed a framework for young people's participation in conflict prevention, the 3 T's that I call them: technical training, technology, and local ties. So we need those local people in the villages of Afghanistan to use technology and to get technical training in order to engage into bringing peace into their own villages, cities, and then throughout Afghanistan and in other countries.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction to really a complex, difficult issue. And for you to be in the Washington, D.C. area and then going back and forth to navigate this is quite a challenge. And we, of course, wish you well as you pursue this with your native Afghanistan. I want to turn to Annika. I would like you to address a little bit more the work of Leading Change Canada, and perhaps to give us a sense of the philosophical or guiding principles behind that initiative, and how it succeeds in getting younger people engaged successfully in international affairs.
Sure, I'm happy to speak about that. So you shared a little bit about what Leading Change does, and it's particularly occupied or interested in engaging and highlighting or lifting young people into spaces where they can meaningfully have conversations about what sustainability looks like to them, and then what the steps are that they can take, but also other stakeholders in the process towards sustainability can should take in order to have youth voices. But I'd actually like to take a step back and think through what are the wider youth engagement organizations, including some of the others that I'm involved with, including Girls Action Foundation and even my daily work, the principles that guide a lot of youth engagement spaces, specifically here in Canada, really aim to essentially engage young people, so folks 18 to 35 years old in these spaces. What I think is missing, and I know this is deviating a little bit from the question, but what I think is missing is really a critical understanding into who are the people that end up in those spaces. So yeah, it's great that we have a priority for young people and we're recruiting people 18 to 35, but what I've found in my personal experience, my travels and in the engagement spaces that I'm in, is you see those same folks over and over again, which is great because I love to, catch up with my friends, but it also means that there's a whole subset of folks whose voices aren't actually being heard, aren't being uplifted. So I think what guides my work and what I think needs to guide a lot of the principles and work in this youth engagement space really comes from really academic frameworks. And I specifically think to frameworks such as the intersectional framework created by the Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. I was just talking about it earlier today. And I think Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality as this recognition that we are more than the sum of our parts. So I myself, I am a woman, I'm a Muslim woman, I'm a person of color, and all of these experiences influence the lived experiences I hold, and therefore influence the perspectives I can bring to conversations about how young people should be involved or can be involved. And I think Nusrat mentioned there's no point in having these conversations is the people who are directly impacted by the policies or outcomes aren't at the table. So it's important to have, of course, more representation, more diversity, but also recognizing that by virtue of those systems or the systems we exist in, by virtue of those identities, there's a reason that certain folks are not represented or visible or at the table in those spaces, not by any virtue of their own incompetence or inability to take part or inability to engage, but rather due to the fact that there are systems in place or barriers that are reinforced or created by the systems we exist in that hinder or create obstacles to their participation. So I think Nasser mentioned, you know, you would love to have young people show up in Germany and be part of these kind of that meet and put in the financial commitment or the multiple days in order to be able to get a visa to attend, that is a huge barrier. Or here in the Canadian context, if certain people, for example, you see the gender wage gap, if women are earning less money than their male counterparts, if Black women or Indigenous women or women of color are earning even less than their white counterparts, that is a significant barrier that will impact their ability to, you know, fly to a conference, that will impact their ability to source childcare to take part in a session, that will impact their ability to allocate volunteer time in order to advocate for themselves. So all of this to say that young people should and should be engaged at these spaces, but we also need to take a critical look at who's not in those spaces and why we're seeing the same faces over and over again, and actually steps meaningfully. Now.
Annika, thank you very much. We a couple of times lost the sound connection to you. That is something that is part of globalization too. That the sound doesn't always work, but it was sporadic. So hopefully, if it leads to trouble, then you would have to sort of restart your connection with us to see if it works better. But stay with it for the moment. Let me turn now to Nils. I'd like you, Nils, to say a bit to our audience about the Young Global Changers, because that, as I said in the introduction, is a community of young people involved in global affairs, like yourself. And my understanding is that a survey was conducted recently among the alumni, so to speak, among the members of this network. Tell us a little bit more about that, and what did the survey involve? What did it show?
Yeah, of course, I'll do that, Dirk. And let me start by explaining a little bit the Young Global Changers. And thankfully, Sophie has already paved the way a little bit for that introduction, because the YGC serve a similar purpose as the Y7 engagement group. The YGC were created in the context of the Global Solution Summit, which is one aspect that feeds into the G20, both the political forum as well as the business and civil society fora that are staying behind that. So it was created as a group of international youth. I'm emphasizing international because it was meant to create a proper representation of people from across the globe, also facilitating participation so that you really have people from the global north and south participating and feeding into the G20. Whether or not it serves its purpose and really provides true representation and participation, then influences decision-making, I think is another topic of conversation. Now, coming to the second part of your question with regards to the survey that we conducted. Last year was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and for that big birthday, we asked ourselves in our YGC group, okay, what is the state of multilateralism today, and how do young people around the world view multilateralism? And so we asked young people. I can't really say it was a properly representative sample. We had, I think, 100, 120 participants. But nevertheless, it gives you an idea of how the younger generation views multilateral institutions and processes. And it doesn't really come as a surprise that one of the main topics that we also discussed now in our panel was heavily emphasized also as a result of our survey, namely that multilateral processes and institutions suffer from a democratic deficit, so that young people are not able to access these institutions and processes and are not able to hold politicians and decision makers accountable. And I think that goes beyond the political fora that we are often looking at, but I think politics is deeply intertwined with business and the economy, with civil society. So I think young people feel an incredible urge to hold decision makers accountable, because these big interrelated and interdisciplinary problems that we are observing across the world, whether it's climate change, wealth inequality, health, or other pressing issues, are not really being tackled. We talk about it, but we are not solving it. And we are most of the time just solving it from the perspective of Western countries that have the upper hand at these decision-making tables. And we are not giving credit to the very diverse perspectives of people across the world that may benefit from globalization and multilateralism in a very different way than Western powers, for instance.
Thank you, Nils. The audience will have noticed that I'm giving each of you the chance here to introduce a bit of the projects, that you're involved in, because that puts a little bit of meat on the whole thing by giving examples of programs or projects that you're involved in. And Radha, you also have been involved with a variety of initiatives, and I'd like to focus in with you on two of them. One is the UNICEF Generation Unlimited initiative, and the other one is the Shared Value Partnerships. Could you tell the audience a little bit about both of these?
Definitely. So primarily, Generation Unlimited is a global multi-sector coalition that works for the needs of 1.8 billion young people across the world. And it is primarily divided into 4 areas of education, employment, entrepreneurship, and engagement. And engagement entails all kinds of youth engagement. So across these 4 areas, it is believed that if there is interventions, right from education to engagement, of course, entrepreneurship and employment being very, very important, it really helps give a very holistic perspective to the needs of young people. In terms of shared value partnerships, I think as the world is changing, it's incredibly important that all stakeholders come together to try and solve multidimensional problems. I mean, like we have seen, say, with the pandemic, just because it was a health issue, it impacted every single facet of our lives. It impacted livelihoods because people lost their jobs. It impacted economies, so it has financial implication. It impacted the environment, positively in a way, right? Because suddenly the nature was blooming because humans were in cages. And then on the other hand, it also impacted education because children were out of school, had to do homeschooling and, online learning, virtual learning. So I think one facet today, in such a globalized world that we live in, impacts every single facet of life. So all these development challenges are all interconnected. And I think this kind of multidimensional connectivity requires a different level of thinking and not rather thinking in silos. And that kind of requires all stakeholders to come together, the private sector, the civil society, the non-profits, the academic, research, all of those. Then, of course, the multilaterals and governments. So when all of them come together at the table, can real problems be solved? And Generation Unlimited tried to do that. And shared value partnerships was basically not just social value, but also economic value. An example could be, so when you kind of have a partnership with an organization, how you can start thinking about redefining markets for them. So there is a financial and economic incentive for them to be involved as well. How can you start looking at, helping them in their value chain? which is over and above the problem you're trying to solve. So I think such kind of social plus economic value gives one a shared value partnership. So trying to shift this narrative, and it's not so easy, especially in the multilateral setup, because everybody is used to grants for some reason. And, people don't talk till there is money on the table. Like, how much money can you put on the table? And then we talk about a partnership. So I think that has to change in a way where one has to create win-win situations for all stakeholders involved, really, to be able to solve problems in a more coherent and cohesive manner. And similarly with UNDP as well. It was helping country governments to manage the fiscal space better, worked across 40 plus countries. And there also, it's a similar mindset where how you can really, bring in, or rather increase the capacities of country governments for them to be able to fund their own development. Because as the world changes, foreign aid, foreign resources are going to dip. So how can countries become more self-sufficient to be able to finance their own development? So I think these are some of the issues that one needs to start thinking about, getting different stakeholders together, sustainability, scalability, and really trying to make a difference, bringing all of these things together under one roof. So, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up, Radha, in your experience with these activities, is it significant for you that you have experience in the national political context? You worked, for one of the offices in the Indian government, to have an experience that combines the national, the international, and perhaps the private sector. You benefit from having that mixture in your background in this work?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I started my career doing consulting at KPMG and then moved doing strategy at the Tata Group, which is a large multinational group, and then moved to the family office of a billionaire where I was managing a portfolio, and then moved to the government, from where I moved to the UN. So really having this perspective of all sides of the table, being a part of a non-profit, being a part of the private sector, being a part of government and multilateral, gives one really different lenses that one can bring to the table. And of course, different geographies. So having lived across, worked across all 5 continents, I think it definitely helps one in terms of, like it was mentioned, like Anika mentioned, there are so many identities that we all hold. I'm a woman of color from a developing country, and having these variety of experiences across different sectors definitely helps in terms of bringing different lenses to the table.
Thank you. Sophie, give us a little bit more of a sense with the Y7, how this group of participants, let's call them, the ones that are involved there, are selected. Where do they come from? How are they selected? And with the G7, one could, of course, have this feeling the summit meeting takes place and then it's ended. And then next year, presumably, there's another one. What do you do in the meantime with this project?
Great, thanks, Dirk. Yeah. So the Y7, how it works is young people from each of the G7 countries plus the European Union are selected each year. There's an official organising committee. So the Future Leaders Network, we're the official organising committee for the United Kingdom, and we have counterparts in each of the G7 states. I can't talk for the other international organising committees, but I can talk for us. And the way that we select people is deliberately chosen to make sure that we do bring in the breadth and diversity of young people, and not just those who have experience of politics, for example. So we operate on a skills-based system, not an experience-based system. So, for example, we look for teamwork. Look for teamwork skills. You can have those teamwork skills from like a bar, or from a sports team, or from your work, whichever one it is, we don't mind. We just want people to have team working skills experiences. And that means that we basically don't only recruit people who are interested in international politics or international relations, those who've been to university. We really make sure that we select people with really rich backgrounds, and we pick teams, not individuals. So we make sure that we bring together a group of people who represent diverse perspectives to truly represent the United Kingdom. This year, actually, on our presidency, we've selected, we've been quite radical in that we've introduced a new group of people to feed into the Y7 process. These are called Youth Forum members, and they were selected to deliberately represent lived experience of the policy recommendations we were talking about. So, for example, in climate and the environment, we had a climate refugee. We had a young woman who is the daughter of a farmer in rural Wales. We had a young person whose entire job is cleaning up the coastline of the United Kingdom. We really wanted to bring in young people who maybe don't have direct experience of policymaking skills, but who had lived experience that were really directly relevant to the things we were talking about. So I guess the selection process is quite it's intended to be quite broad, and we've intentionally this year brought in more youth voices to make sure that happens. Those young people have worked together for the last 6 months to form part of the Y7 process, and I talked a little bit about that earlier. But you talked a little bit there around like what happens next, right? So the first is we build on the commitments that were made in that leaders declaration. So I have a really great relationship with the UK G7 Sherpa, and I spoke to him just yesterday, and we talked, number one, about some of the commitments made to involve young people in digital and technology. A big part of that won't happen immediately, but it will happen in around September time when the G7 hosts its Future of Technology meeting, and we'll be bringing young people directly into that. We're hoping to create a youth council as a direct result of the Y7's work this year. So not only will we be kind of holding to account on the commitments that we saw that were in there, we'll also be holding to account on the commitments that weren't in there that we think were really important. And that has a view to next year, to the Germans. It will be quite a new year for the Germans, obviously with a new chancellor and a kind of whole new kind of administration, I guess, in the German sphere next year. But a big part of our work will be making sure that young people's voices this year don't automatically get lost. And that's I guess my final point is that sometimes it can be really hard with youth participation work because we're working with volunteers. We often recruit them for like a year-long basis. They like come and go. So one group comes in, they have their priorities, then the next group comes in, has their priorities. A big part of our work will be making sure that our priorities are seen forward into next year.
Well, thank you. One of the central issues or problems in global affairs is the question of poverty, particularly because it is entangled with so many other aspects that particularly also impact younger people. Think of access to education and quality of education. Nasrat, one of your projects has been the Asyl app, dealing with the question of poverty. Can you say a little bit more about that initiative?
So Asyl, spelled as ASEEL, is a mobile app for iOS, Android phones, and we have a website as well that tries to tackle this problem of globalization where certain technologies, let's just say the internet penetration globally around 1998, 1999 skyrocketed. The whole world was getting into the internet. But then around the years 2003, 4, 5, when most of the world, the submarine cables and the internet was connected, many countries were left. And so that last 10 to 15% of any infrastructure is really hard to connect. And they are usually from rural places where people need it the most. So right now, believe it or not, there are countries that the people do not have access to credit cards. They don't have PayPal accounts. There is no shipping. People don't have addresses. Yes, the Universal Postal Union and the postal infrastructure of house numbers, zip codes was something that started in 1940s, I guess. And as most of the countries developed into it, the last 10% again was left. Same can be said about the internet. Same can be said about the current fintech infrastructure, and then blockchains, which then goes on top of the internet again, which leaves this specific amount of people which are in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Africa, some Latin American countries. So I created the Asyl app that enables artisans in Afghanistan right now to sell their products to people in the US, Australia, and hopefully soon in Europe as well. It's easy. You download the app, just like Amazon. Now you have access to buying things from Afghanistan, whereas in a normal case, you cannot buy there. The biggest companies, trillion-dollar company Amazon, is very eager to take over the most developed parts of the world because people have more money. That money is not being used to build the infrastructure for these problematic places of the world. And so as a young technologist, I thought, maybe I could go and change that. And within 3 years, we have changed that. There is 500 artisans that we empower right now. I do not care as much about the amount of money that it gives us, as much as I know that selling their embroidery would give them and their families the opportunity to build things better for themselves. And that's where I think globalization and the first priority of globalization has to be to look at places that are not covered. And then from there on, build up and cover more issues and the most developed economies of the world.
Thank you. I want to turn to Annika again. Many years ago, a speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States, Tip O'Neill, maybe you heard of him, he said, all politics is local. And so we're dealing with global issues here, but thinking of the kinds of projects that you're involved with, and also the systemic obstacles that you have identified that so often stand in the way of meaningful engagement. How do you see, even in a society like Canada, which many people would see as a developed, progressive kind of society, where do you see systemic obstacles on the local level? Where do you see opportunities for younger people to make a difference where they are, and not to have this big, image of changing the whole world, but starting it locally?
That's a great question. Actually, when I do anti-oppression work, when I share with folks the kind of multiple avenues to address these systems, address these barriers, I usually encompass it in two different ways. There's always the top-down approach, which is when you are in the weeds with policies and programs, and you're trying to intentionally counteract things, stuff like what Sophie's doing, stuff like what we're talking about changing, shifting policies. But there's also such a value in working from the grassroots, from the bottom up. And this is actually where you can get the more short-term, quicker solutions. Because yes, it's important to adjust and change or tear down the systems that are creating barriers. But in the meantime, as that long process continues, how are we actually building in solutions so that the people who are impacted by these systems have opportunities and have access to spaces that they need to have access to in order to be successful? So I think there's so many different ways, and there's no one right way. There's no wrong way at all. What I've seen is a lot of mobilization of folks from these communities working together and working across context. So we see here tons of folks, for example, from the LGBTQ plus community working in solidarity with Black, Indigenous people of color. We see these folks working with people with disabilities and recognizing that it's the same systems that impact all of us. They impact us differently, but they're fundamentally the same systems. And when we're thinking through where we go with this and how to connect this to the global, I think recognizing that the local is the local impact is a legacy or a kind of a smaller picture of the global issue. So we need to recognize that, yeah, we have to achieve clean water for all, or internet access for all, or technological access for all. But that also starts with making sure that your neighbor has a computer so that they can go to school, right? It means that looking in Indigenous communities and First Nations communities here in Canada, making sure they have access to clean water. And I will actually even take this a step further and say that, yes, the global and the local are connected, but also the personal is the political. And recognize that your personal experience is the best information and the best influence to take advantage of, to harness, so that you can create political change. Because just as much as it is important to connect the local to the global, it is as important to connect your personal experience to the political spaces, whether at the local level or the global level, to the political spaces that you're in.
Thank you so much, Annika. Nils, I want to address another initiative that you are associated with, and that is the Youth Alliance for Multilateralism. This is supposed to be a network of people involved in multilateral work, okay, careers. Is it only meant for people on the inside professionally of this kind of network, or how do you reach out to the people outside who might want to get involved?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. That's an excellent question, and also I think we still have a long way to go towards an initiative. Right now, it's a prototype. It's a white paper that we've worked on as YGCs in order to address the issue that has been reoccurring also tonight, namely the democratic deficit in multilateral processes and institutions. So as a fix to this issue, and it can really only be one solution as part of many, is to create an alliance of young people, a diverse network of young people from around the world, both on a national as well as on a subnational level, because I do think that we need to be a bit aware that there can't be one voice speaking for very diverse countries as well. So we would like to build a network of young change makers from around the world that can then participate on behalf of young generations in multilateral processes and institutions. So how would that work? We would, or we foresee that alliance to operate as a kind of distributed network around the globe with its national and subnational charters. And this alliance together can then offer advice, support, and advocacy, and propose effective solutions in these multilateral processes and institutions, and then also hold decision makers in these institutions accountable to the discourse that they are pursuing. Another aspect of that alliance would be close partnerships and open dialogues with civil society, because in order to create true participation and also inclusivity, the alliance needs to, on the one hand, gain acceptance among other networks, and as well gain trust from people that it's actually following up with what it's promising. So we are hoping that with such a network, we can, on the one hand, provide better representation and participation in these multilateral fora, institutions, and processes, but then also to really create solutions to these pressing challenges of our time, that we're actually moving towards a more sustainable future for people. And also, I realize now talking to you about it, and like having said that it's a white paper and a prototype, I would also like to invite not only the panelists of today's discussion, but also people in the audience to get in touch with us, provide us with feedback, because I think especially such an idea only can gain true life if we can get as many perspectives as possible, and if we can start fine-tuning that prototype and then really provide or propose a good solution to whether it's the G20, the G7, or a lot of other talk shops. We need to get to something concrete when it comes to these challenges of our time.
Thank you, Nils. Radha, one of the areas that you have experience in is development financing. And as they say, money makes the world go round. But money is also one of those things that worldwide has led to structures that are hard to break down and hard to, in a transparent sense, get a sense of countries often facing themselves on the short end of the stick, so to speak, when it comes to the financial side of things. Tell us a little bit about your experience with development financing, and is there a particular role there for younger generations? What's your take on that?
So, I mean, rightly, as you pointed out, that there is definitely great value in rethinking some of the traditional models of financing, because like you said, finance does make the world go round. Because, I mean, you can think about all the development in the world that we want to do, but the fundamental question that remains, which is at the bottom of it all, is that where's the money going to come from, and who is going to fund it, and how are we going to actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. As per the UN, there is a deficit of about $2.5 trillion for achieving the SDGs. So where is this deficit going to be covered, and how different stakeholders can really come together? So yes, I think it's very, very important for all of us young people to start thinking about innovative models to finance development. It could be through blended financing, where the private and the public sector come together. It could be through a variety of other ways in which governments can finance it, such as, there are a variety of bonds that have come up, like education impact bonds, or, to try and conserve the economy. There is, conserve the environment. There is green bonds, there is blue bonds, which is for primarily island states. So how you can really create an economy around water. So how can one start looking at blue bonds, or marine conservation? How can one start looking at green bonds? How can one start looking at blended financing? How can one start looking at other development kind of funding, such as diaspora bonds as well? Like there are so many countries which have a huge diaspora across the world. So how they can be tapped. Like there are so many. Crowdfunding, crowdsourcing is so big right now. So I think mobilizing all of these incredible opportunities that we have gotten due to different stakeholders being active, or the global community being really so connected with the advent of the internet, and reaching that last mile. So definitely, I think it is incredibly important to try and bring all of these efficiencies into the large-scale sustainable development process, because without which the traditional models of financing, or traditional models of norm setting, or intergovernmental arrangements are going to quickly fade away. So how perhaps governments can start looking at global compacts instead of traditional models of intergovernmental norm setting. So I think all of these changes, I think, would be underway, or rather should be underway. As I mentioned earlier, like from risk aversion to innovation, and I think from more competition or trying to kind of guard one's territory, it's more about how one can really collaborate. And I think for all of this to really happen, the most important factor to my mind is authentic and relatable leadership. Across country governments, across multilateral agencies, across the private sector, that will really not only attract young people, but also, I think, bring all the stakeholders together and keep them there until we, try and solve some of these problems that are, fast turning into, global challenges. So I think definitely financing will be critical in solving all of these development challenges.
Thank you so much, Radha. Sophie, I have a question for you about Future Leaders Network. You are CEO of that. When was that created? It is only in Britain as a network. Are there kindred organizations abroad in other countries that you are networking with? Give us a little bit of background there. It's a professional circle of people who are involved in international careers, but again, it's focused in Britain. So how did that come about? When and how? And how do you connect with other countries there?
Sure. So the Future Leaders Network originally started its life actually named as the Youth Diplomatic Service. And it was originally aimed at kind of its core business was selecting young people from the United Kingdom to represent the UK at the G7 and G20 Youth Summit, so the Y7 and the Y20. It transitioned to become the Future Leaders Network back in 2015. So mainly just a rebranding. The kind of core business of selecting and supporting young people to represent the UK at the G7 and G20 Youth Summits remain the same. That being said, I guess and within that means we do have, as you say, these kind of international counterparts in each of the G7 and G20 states. So we work really closely with the organizing committees, the official organizing committees of each of those states, and have brilliant relationships to kind of share ideas, share solutions about how we can make youth engagement in those processes as effective as possible. I guess what's kind of interesting about the FLN is that we're not just a kind of youth participation in global decision-making process. We are actually a leadership organization. And I guess if I can kind of walk you through our argument, it's that leadership matters. Leadership really, really matters. And especially now in a time of crisis, we know that good leadership really, really matters. And yet leadership training tends to be too little too late. So people tend to get leadership training after they've been a leader. I think there was a Harvard Business Review thing which found that like the average age of an executive on leadership training was 42, which is almost a decade after they'd originally started leading at the age of 33, though I think most people start leading a lot earlier than that. And we're set up to tackle that problem by offering kind of young people, which is where we think the problem starts, offering young people leadership development training, experience, and networks. So we operate primarily in the United Kingdom right now to make sure that we have this network of young leaders who get great experiences at being leaders. You know, some of the stuff that wouldn't ordinarily be given to them, we give directly to them. We give them the core training, the skills training, and we give them the core networks. And what that means is we use our Y7 and Y20 opportunities, not just as kind of means for young people to participate in international decision making, but also as kind of leadership development opportunities for young people. This global reach, but this UK focus on building the next generation of leaders in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Now I'm going to make a round here of a similar question again for all of you, and because I want to get to a sort of a summary, a conclusion here. I get a sense also this is going to be an issue that interests some of members of our audience who are concerned about the grassroots dimension of engagement by young people. Because after all, again, you have to start locally, you have to start where you are with your own personality, your own life, and so on. And for each of you to give the audience a sense, and imagine yourself sitting in front of a group of younger people about to, say, finish high school, you know, and go on to studies or work or whatever, who are saying, what can you tell me? What are the basic principles that should guide me? What are the thoughts that I should have about moving forward? What is a realistic path, and so on? We're going to start with you, Radha, because you sent me a slide that we're going to show the audience. And why don't you start off this issue and tell us a little bit about this picture? You should be able to see it momentarily.
Yes. So I think primarily this is like very, very common in terms of a way of thinking, that it is that sweet spot where doing something what one loves, something that they're good at, something that can actually pay them, and something that the world needs. So this could be literally a sweet spot, which if one can find would be incredibly helpful for them to guide themselves in their career and their life. And I think what's really important is asking yourself what makes you truly happy, and what is it that you're really passionate about, and what you think you can really contribute towards, given your skill set. Like given my example, I mean, I changed 3 careers in about 15 years, not 3 jobs, but 3 careers. So I started with finance, moved to strategy, and then moved to policy. So I think it requires courage to follow your heart and don't give up. If I were to advise my younger self, I would also say that be kinder to yourself. It's okay that some people know it all at once, what they want to do, Some people, it could take 15 years like I did. And it's okay. Everybody will have their own timelines. And I think what's really, really important is the honest intent, courage, tenacity, and perseverance. And the attitude really to keep moving forward no matter what, and keep looking, don't settle. Because I think, that's something that I believe in, that we live only once, and I would rather live the life that, it's better to, as it said, it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. So it's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. Just go for what you really think you can contribute towards. And finding that sweet spot. And it may take a while, but I promise you'll eventually get there if you have that tenacity and perseverance. And there will be roadblocks. Don't get me wrong. Of course, we live in a very fast-changing world. So there are societal constraints, family constraints, financial constraints. There will be a variety of constraints. But if you keep looking and don't settle, then life will find a way. And opportunities will keep coming, and that will actually be your segue to your next stage in terms of what you want to do, which literally happened to me, changing 3 careers. So I hope you find your finance to strategy to policy too. And I would wish the entire audience all the very, very best, and hope that we all together can make the world a better place and be the change we wish to see.
Thank you so much, Radha. We will leave this picture up there if we can, and we will turn to Nils. Nils, your concluding thoughts here on how to motivate people to get involved.
That's such a difficult follow-up to the very valid and inspiring points that Radha just proposed. If I can offer my 2 cents to this question, I think what helped me maybe the most was to, and I don't want to sound esoteric here, but to really open my heart and my mind to the world around me. I think with most issues that we encounter in our life, we realize that there's neither one answer or one perspective to an issue or a problem. So keeping your heart and your mind open and developing a sense also of interdisciplinarity, learning different crafts, talking to different people, and being open when trying to find solutions is, I think, key. And throughout that entire process, I think just be kind to yourself and to your surroundings. We all want to be agents of change, and we need to be persistent, and we need to push for it. But at the same time, we are all humans, and humans carry different fears and different experiences. So if you really want to get people on board, and if you really want to drive change, everybody needs to sit with you, not in the driver's seat, but at least on the passenger seat, because there are, as you, Dirk, I think at the beginning said, there are a lot of people that are very cosmopolitan, but there are also people who much rather would like to stick to their local communities, and everybody needs to be on board in order to find solutions to problems in our complex times.
Thank you, Nils. Sophie, your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Radha, for bringing forward I think it's the ikigai, isn't it? This kind of this diagram. I think you're so right on finding your purpose. So I was a civil servant for 8 years, and I left my job to focus on the Y7 and encouraging youth participation in the G7, entirely unpaid. It was the best decision I could ever make in my life, because I found something that I care about, I love, I'm really passionate about. And so 100% back you on that. I guess if I can talk about the one barrier that I encountered in making that leap of faith was like, why would anyone listen to me? Like, what impact will I have in the world? Why would anyone care that I'm spending my time on this? And I think it came down to a real lack of self-esteem in credibility, and especially in the credibility of young people. Sometimes it can feel really scary, as a young person in a room with lots of old people, or lots of people who don't look like you, to feel like you have credibility. And I guess there's kind of 2 things I'd say to that. The first is, you are an expert in being a young person, and have faith in that, have faith in the fact that you know what it is like to be a young person. And the experience of being a young person now is very different to the experience of being a young person 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So don't ignore that really huge realm of expertise that you own. And the second is that credibility isn't given to you. You create credibility, and you create that through a mixture of passion and perseverance. You know, if you care about what you're talking about, other people will follow. And if you try really hard and you keep doing those really boring tasks, sending those emails, asking those people to be part of your cause, creating these events that maybe no one comes to the first time, but maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 people come the next times, that perseverance really pays off, and it creates that credibility. You know, my role, the chair of Y7, it had no credibility when I started, and I ended up speaking to the Prime Minister. So I think what really inspires me is, if you feel like there's something that you really care about, go for it. Do it. You will do something amazing. You can create the scenario in which you create the change in the world that you want to be.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Nasrat, can we hear your thoughts on this?
It's a good question. I think the way I see it, for young people, in order to be impactful, I think it's important to start, you know, when people are growing up and in their earliest of times, to and we're kind of that way, that we look at technical things, and I encourage that a lot, to start with. You know, people should look at technical things. They should learn how the internet works, how, you know, power works, how anything really works. So learning that technical thing is where you start from, and then you get into more strategic stuff, leadership stuff, that soft power that you were referring to. And then kind of getting into a drive, doing projects and things like that, you know, real life application of the technical things and the strategic things. And then let's not forget, I think the most important thing, especially people who are in their 20s to 30s, is to look at words. I think started with technical things, getting into strategy, leadership, things like that, doing projects, but coming back and just thinking of words, and words such as fear, words such as poverty, words such as war, you know, love, and things like that. And then coming back from this word, the words, and just kind of, you know, using that whole pair of knowledge, from technical things to, you know, how things are managed, operations and things like that, and then actually understanding a single word could take us months. And so using that whole, you know, approach, I think going back, if you could go through this journey by your 30s and 40s, I think you would be able to scale back until the end of your life and actually make a pretty dramatic change in a part of the world, at least, if not globally. And then in the process, I like to tell everyone who works with me is to gamify things. I think when I was young, I built an e-commerce platform, and then I went through this whole process, and today I'm building another e-commerce platform. Nasrat at the age of 14 was doing that. Nasrat at the age of 30 is doing the same thing. It's just that I have a very different understanding, and the scale of what I do is very different.
Thank you, Nasrat. And the final word here goes to Annika.
Thanks so much. I'll try to keep it brief, but I think the core of my advice, insight, whatever you want to call it, is it starts with you. And you, like Sophie mentioned, you are the expert on what it means to be a young person. You are the expert of what it means to be you. And recognize that, like I mentioned before, the personal is the political. Your experiences, your lived experiences, your unique lived experiences are incredibly valuable to the grand scheme of things, even if you might feel a little bit like a mote of dust floating in the wind. You are so, so important, and there's no one who can do the work you can do better than you can. It's a little kitschy, but I also recommend, if you're trying to figure out what your passion is or your interests are, what was really helpful years ago, I had a mentor, Dr. Catherine Bolzendahl, who made me go through a mission creation exercise, like create your own personal mission, and that was incredibly helpful. It's actually what I use as the introduction of every single one of my bios. So take stock in that and try to find those opportunities to get an understanding of what it is that you bring that is unique to the space, and what it is that you're interested in. Because when you're interested in something, when you bring your whole and authentic self to the spaces you're in, the opportunities will create themselves. They will find you. It's a matter of you figuring out yourself what it is you want to do. And finally, the sentence that I shared earlier that I borrow from the Palestinian liberation movement is, existence is resistance. We exist in a society, in a context that was built by generations before us for that generation's benefit. So the fact that we exist here and we exist wholly as ourselves is a form of resistance. So take advantage of that, and take advantage of what it is that you bring uniquely to the space that you're in, and use that as the springboard to create change. And I look forward to hearing and seeing where all of you end up one day.
Thank you, Annika. I must say, as a moderator who belongs to a bit older generation in the meantime, it's been wonderful to hear all these different perspectives. It reminds me a bit also of my undergraduate days. I was a student at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, where from the 1950s onward, the United Nations flag was flown alongside the United States flag. That was very unusual. It's the alma mater of Kofi Annan. And so it's a college that's very, very international, and many of the things that were said tonight remind me of the kinds of students also that surrounded me as I was a student there. Was great benefit. And so I'm so grateful that you have shared your expertise, your experiences, your inspiration with the audience, and with those who will also later on watch this recording on YouTube. Thank you again. I want to conclude the evening by giving the audience a bit of a preview, because we have some more things coming up. In the fall, Berlin Talks will continue, and on September 16th, we will have a session, a panel discussion about populism and the future of democracy in Europe. And so you can always go to the website fuberlin.de/Berlin Talks for the latest information. And here we have some more online information, online courses, both in the FUBiS case and in the FUBest case, as you can see here. So go to our website if you're interested in finding out what these programs all have to offer in the course of time. And you can follow us on social media. As you can see here, both programs are richly represented at the various social media sites. So with that, it is again my pleasure to thank the panel for their insights. I'm grateful to them for having shared their time with us. Also, the audience for having joined in. I wish everyone well. I wish everyone a wonderful summer that is now breaking out upon us. And hopefully then we will have everyone tune in again in September. With that, good night. Bye-bye.